Luke chapters 15 and 16. That's what we're going to look at today. Gospel of Luke chapters 15 and 16. Last week we were looking in John, and we were looking at a couple of stories and some teaching attached to those stories as we looked at the feeding of the 5,000 plus, followed immediately by Jesus walking on the water. You know, he'd sent the disciples across the lake and he was walking on the water. And then immediately following that was some teaching in regards to Jesus being the bread of life connected to those two stories. What we discovered last week was that Jesus longs to be our source. In the feeding of the 5,000, as the little boy came and just brought this minimal amount of resources that he had and turned it all over to the Lord, to the source, we saw an incredible miracle take place. And then Jesus sends the disciples across the lake, tells them that he's going to meet them on the other side. In the midst of that traveling, a storm brews, and we see the disciples become quite fearful, struggling. Jesus is walking on that storm, walking on the waters of that storm. Jesus, again, showing the fact that he is the source, even for our emotional and physical needs. And then he follows all that up by talking to the crowd about the fact that he is the bread of life, the source of our spiritual need. He is our source. And we're going to uncover some interesting things today in regard to stewardship as well. In Luke chapter 15, I'm not going to read the details in this chapter, but we're going to cover them real quickly. But you've got it, because we have to understand a couple of things. We have to understand who it is that Jesus is talking to. If we don't realize who he's talking to, we're going to miss the boat on what he's talking about. So, first couple of chapters in 15, now the tax collectors and sinners were all gathering around to hear him. But the Pharisees and the teachers of the law muttered, "This man welcomes sinners and eats with them." So let's picture this. Over here to my left, we have the church leaders of the day. The good church folks over here, and they're the ones muttering about Jesus, engaging this crowd right here in front of me, the sinners and the tax collectors, because Jesus is engaging them and he's welcoming them and he's eating with them, and they're irritated by the fact that Jesus is doing that. And then over here we've got the disciples that are traveling around Jesus, just kind of following him and experiencing all that it is that Jesus is doing. That's our picture, okay? And then Jesus begins to talk to this crowd with three parables. Very familiar parables. The parable of the lost coin, parable of the lost sheep, parable of the lost son or the prodigal son. We have to keep them together because they are together for a reason. See, Jesus begins to tell them about this lady that lost this valuable coin, and she searched high and low until she found it. And when she found it, there was a great party. Then he went on to say, and then there was this man who lost a sheep, and he left the 99 to go look for that sheep. Sheep was valuable enough that he left the ones that were safe, went out to find that sheep, and when he found that sheep, brought it back, and there was a tremendous party. But then there was this man, and he had two sons. And one son was quite an obedient son, stayed around and did the work all the time. This other son, the younger one, demanded his portion of the inheritance, took the money and left and squandered it. And that is a key word, squandered it, to the point where when he was all out, he was hanging out with pigs. He even longed to eat what the pigs were eating. So he developed a scheme. This younger son developed a scheme on how he was going to re-engage with the father. But not as son and father anymore. He was going to actually come on his hands and knees and ask to just be a servant. So that at least in the servant's quarters, he could have a place to sleep, roof over his head, and the servants were eating better than what he was at that point. Meanwhile, the older son is maintaining the daily grind of the immediate. And so one day, this amazing day, the younger son finally crests the hill. Father sees him from a long ways off and runs out to him, embraces him, puts a robe on his neck, a ring on his finger, kills the fatted calf, throws a huge party because the son who was dead, who was lost, has now been found. He is returned. And while that party is taking place, older son is angry. He's irritated because he's been doing the daily grind. He didn't blow. He didn't squander the inheritance, but he never had a party thrown from him. And there's this confrontation between father and son at the very end of chapter 15. Let's pick up the reading there. Verse 31. My son, the father said, you're always with me, and everything I have is yours. But we had to celebrate and be glad because this brother of yours was dead and is alive again. He was lost and is found. There is this high level of value that God has with his people. And it's not just the found ones, it's not just the good son, but it's the lost son. It's the one that has squandered life. And these people don't have that perspective of these people. But Jesus has that perspective on both. The value is high. The value is high for you. Do you understand your value? It's high. And maybe somebody in here just needed to hear that alone and allow that to sink in today. Regardless of your category, regardless of if you think you're here or you think you're here or you even think you're over here, the value is the same in God's sight. And it is a high value. He values you. Jesus is telling these three stories to this group of people, irritated at the fact that Jesus is dialoguing with and hanging out with these people. At that point, Jesus turns to this crowd at the beginning of chapter 16. This is where we pick up the reading. And he tells a really challenging, difficult to understand, confusing parable to this group, knowing that we have to keep in mind that these people are still here and these people are still here, but now he's FaceTime with his disciples, okay? Here's what he says to them. Jesus told his disciples, there was a rich man whose manager was accused of wasting his possessions. So he called him in and asked him, what is this I hear about you? Give an account of your management because you cannot be manager any longer. The wasting of possessions is a whole lot like the squandering of the prodigal son. You start to see the connection. Okay, Jesus is still in this mode, all right? This manager has been squandering the owner's possessions. So he calls him in and asks him, what is this I hear about you? Give an account of your management because you cannot be manager any longer. So the manager says to himself, what am I going to do now? My master is taking away my job. The truth is, I'm not strong enough to be a digger, and I'm way too ashamed to become a beggar. I know what I'll do. I know what I'll do so that when it's going to happen, when I lose my job here, people will welcome me into their homes. I know I've got a scheme figured out when the right now comes to an end and the next phase it takes place. I've got a plan. I've got somewhere to go. So, this is what he does. He calls in each one of his master's debtors. He asked the first debtor, how much do you owe my master, the owner? 800 gallons of olive oil was the reply. So the manager told him, take your bill, sit down quickly, and make it 400. Then he called in a second debtor. How much do you owe? 1,000 bushels of wheat, he replied. And he says, take your bill and make it 800. And don't you wish the electric company would do that for us? Here's the interesting part of this story. Check this out. The master commended the dishonest manager because he had acted shrewdly. Let's pause there for a moment. That is the end of the parable. Is that not the most confusing parable you think you would hear from Jesus? I mean, you get, I'd understand if we're talking about character here, if Jesus would dig into honesty, he would dig into trustworthiness, but it seems that this manager who has proven to squander things in the immediate that belong to the owner, that suddenly when he realizes that he's about to lose his job, he puts this scheme into place and he pulls in these guys that owe money to the owner and he says, make your bill lower, and befriends himself to these people. Understand that this parable is not about character. Jesus is not condoning dishonesty, but what this is about is a change, a transformation that happens with this dishonest, shrewd manager. In the immediate, this manager has blown it. Everything that has been given to him, entrusted to him by the owner, he has squandered it, and he has wasted the opportunity that he had been given as manager. His job is about to end, and he realizes that what is going to happen next, what is beyond this managership. And he realizes that he's got to get something in place so that the next phase, or really in Jesus' mind, the point of the parable, the eternal, is set. And there is a transformation, a movement that takes place with this manager from the immediate to the eternal. Now, I remind you that here's this crowd irritated at the fact that Jesus is dialoguing with sinners in the immediate. But what they don't understand is that there is an eternal perspective that Jesus has with these people because of their value. I'm intrigued at the fact that he goes from these people who are stuck in the immediate, the church of the now, and he spins around and he looks at the church of the future, the church leaders of the next phase. And he begins to talk to them about the fact that God's perspective is that value is the same all the way across the board, and that it is critical that you and I, with the things that we have been given, have an eternal perspective on things. Not stuck in the immediate, in the here and now, but that there is like a lifting of the eyes and we can see things the way God sees them. This manager makes a serious shift from being locked in to the squandering phase of the immediate and gets an eternal perspective. Wow, my ducks have to be in a row. And you begin to see this crowd again, the sinners, the prodigal ones that have squandered life to that point, had squandered the resources that God had given them to that point. The ones that this crowd is irritated with. And then Jesus continues. Start at verse 8 again. So the master commends the dishonest manager because he had acted shrewdly. For the people of this world are more shrewd in dealing with their own kind than are the people of the light. I tell you, use worldly wealth to gain friends for yourselves, so that when it is gone, you will be welcomed into eternal dwellings. You begin to see the point of the parable. For whoever can be trusted with very little can also be trusted with much. And whoever is dishonest with very little will also be dishonest with much. So, if you have not been trustworthy in handling worldly wealth in the immediate, in the here and now, who will trust you with true riches in the eternal? And if you have not been trustworthy with someone else's property, who will give you property of your own? No servant can serve two masters. Either he will hate the one and love the other, or he will be devoted to the one and despise the other.